Today I'm going to present some results from some work that the South West Catchments Council in collaboration with DBCA and the Blackwood Basin Group have been doing in the Upper Warren area in the southern Jarrah forest, looking at using Felixers to control feral cats. So I want to acknowledge Adrian and Marika from DBCA who've worked through all the painfulness of getting approvals to go into toxic mode with Felixers and managing them in the field. My colleagues Durrani Sullivan and Jane Puntland for going through, at this point, over 2 million images out of our cameras, and Clint and Carrie from the Blackwood Basin Group for going and checking all the cameras for us. I also want to acknowledge the Kanigang people of the Noongar Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land where we're working. If you're not familiar with the Felixer grooming trap, I'm sure there's no one here who isn't, so I'll move on. So in the southern forest, our program is looking at 3 aspects of the use of Felixer trap. The first is, are they safe for non-target species? The Upper Warren area has 10 threatened or priority mammal species which are potentially affected by predation by feral cats. And obviously it's no good if we go out there and use a device which is potentially dangerous for any of those species. We want to know whether the Felixers can be effective at reducing feral cat numbers and activity across a meso-scale in the landscape, and if they are, looking at how we optimise their use to get the best bang for our buck. So based on a SECA design analysis of existing cat density and movement data in that area, thanks to previous work by DBCA, we determined that using 8 Felixers we could cover an area of around about 15 to 20,000 hectares of Jarrah forest, and so we've been working on those sites at that scale. Across each of those sites we've set 50 remote cameras to monitor cat activity and ID as many of the individual cats as we can. And then at the sites where we've been working, we've had 8 Felixer traps set across those areas. So the first question of, are they safe for non-target species? So to answer this question, we started off with some pen testing of Felixers for numbats at the Perth Zoo, and then we've collected a large amount of data in the field, both in non-toxic mode and going into toxic mode. So it's nearly 2,500 trap days with the Felixers in the field, of which we'd had 6,200 odd detections, primarily in conservative mode. We've recently gone into standard mode targeting with the traps, which has changed things a little bit. So of all the potential non-target species in that area, we have had a number of misidentified targets, and all bar one of these has been recently having gone into standard mode. The most commonly misidentified target is woylies, which we're not particularly concerned about, because to kill a woylie you'd have to shoot it 19 times in a 24-hour period and have it groom off all of the gel. Similarly, Tamar wallabies, which are the most susceptible of the non-targets that we've had, would need 8 gels in a 24-hour period. So if an individual happens to stand in front of a trap that much and get shot that much and groom off the gels every time, it's just natural selection. So, have the Felixers been effective? So in our first trial, in our first 2 trials where we deployed the Felixers trying to get an even spread over the region with no prior knowledge of where the cats were, we achieved at a first site 45 to 88% removal of the known individual cats in the areas, and in the second 40 to 67%. Now these are ranges of known individuals because unfortunately we have quite a few black cats, so we can't be precise about the number of individuals, but based on where we detect cats at different points in the camera array over time, we have a range of estimates of the number of black cats. So in our first 2 trials, we were kind of averaging about 50% of the cats taken out over a 10 to 15 week deployment of the Felixers. In the third trial, we had a bit over a year's worth of camera monitoring data of that site, as we'd been using it as a control for the first 2 trials. So using that data, we deployed the Felixers where we had known hotspots of cat activity, and through the trial moved them into areas where we were seeing increases in cat activity. And in that trial, we managed to take out 74 to 89% of the feral cats over a 12-week period. So that was roughly 17 out of 21 feral cats, which we were really happy about. Well, we targeted them. So the question is, were they killed? We didn't have GPS collars on them to determine with absolute certainty, so we looked at an analysis of, for cats where we had individual identification, we looked at what was the probability that we detect of daily detection of those cats prior to them being targeted by the Felixers. With that probability of daily detection, we could then look, after they were targeted by the Felixers, what was the probability that they were still present in the area, but we just didn't see them. And these results are down the bottom. For some reason, it's dropped off that bottom line. I'm sorry about that. But basically, the probability that the animals were still alive was incredibly low. So we're confident that the animals which are targeted are now dead. There's a few where the probabilities are much higher, but that's just because we had very few detections of those individuals prior to them being targeted. So what did we see in terms of cat activity across those sites? So we had, across the 3 trials, a reduction of 49%, 31% and 74% at the 3 trial sites, going from just before the Felixers were deployed to when they were removed. And this was compared to a reference site that we were monitoring at the same time. The first trial, where we had a 49% reduction in cat activity, that reduction was sustained for 5 months after the Felixers were removed. But what we saw in the more successful, more recent trial, where we took out a greater percentage of the feral cats in that area, was that activity increased much more rapidly after we removed the Felixers. Essentially, it seems like we're creating a stronger vacuum to pull more cats into the area the more we take out. So, having done these 3 trials and knowing that if you've got 50 cameras and and a year's worth of data, you can successfully target where the feral cats were, we wanted to look at the next step in terms of going operational with these traps, and to say, well, can we go into an area where we're naive about where the feral cats are, and can we deploy them successfully? So we ran an analysis of landscape variables against our camera trapping data to look at what variables we could use to predict where the feral cats were in the landscape and how that was changing over time. We tested a whole heap of variables, and the ones that came out as most significant were topographic wetness, track type, and topographic wetness had an interaction with season. So basically the story is that we're most likely to encounter cats if we deploy Felixers on maintained tracks as opposed to ones which are unmaintained and becoming overgrown, in areas of high topographic wetness, so areas where water collects in the landscape and presumably you get more landscape productivity, between August and November. Outside of those areas, as the landscape as a whole tends to dry out, the cats seem to become much more dispersed across the landscape and not targeted in those areas. So that's what we're up to at the moment. We've deployed our Felixers based on a landscape analysis of a new site where we're working, and we've also gone from using conservative mode targeting to standard mode targeting in the current trial. And we'll let you know what happens. So overall, it's looking at the moment like there's real potential in the use of Felixers to achieve meso-scale feral cat reduction in the southern Jarrah forest. Obviously, knocking them down in the first place is only the first step, and we then need to move on to look at how we can sustain those reductions to get recovery in our susceptible native fauna. But importantly, it looks like the Felixers are another tool to add to our toolbox to achieve sustained feral cat control and unthreatened fauna recovery in the southern Jarrah forest. Thank you.